On the operetta front, ever since Bittersweet, Noel had tried to find a successor. And now he got it with Conversation Piece, a romantic, sentimental musical comedy set in Regency Brighton. The score for it, however, gave Noel a number of problems. I was working at Goldenhurst, Coward wrote later. I had completed some odd phrases here and there, but the main waltz theme simply would not come, and I decided that my career was over as a songwriter. I was firmly and miserably stuck. I didn't care if I became fried as a coot, so I poured myself another whiskey and decided to go to bed. I switched off the light at the door, and then noticed there was one lamp left on by the piano. I walked over automatically to turn it off, sat down and played I'll Follow My Secret Heart straight through in G-flat, a key in which I had never played before. Starring in Conversation Piece with Noel himself was the French singer Yvonne Printemps. "1934 was notable for one other Coward lyric, a song which, though it's never been a part of any of his shows, is nonetheless perhaps more closely identified with him than any of the other 300 that form his output. He once wrote, "Its universal appeal lies, I believe, in its passionate sincerity. It's a genuine cri de coeur, and as such cannot fail to ring true. Unhappily, its effectiveness from the point of view of propaganda has been negligible."
Regarding your dear Mrs. Worthington of Wednesday the 23rd, although your baby may be keen on a stage career, how can I make it clear this is not a good idea for her to hope, dear Mrs. Worthington, is on the face of it absurd. Her personality is not in reality exciting enough, inviting enough for this particular sphere. Don't put your daughter on the stage, Mrs. Worthington. Don't put your daughter on the stage. She's a bit of an ugly duckling, you must honestly confess, and the width of her seat would surely defeat her chances of success. It's a loud voice, and though it's not exactly flat, she'll need a little more than that to earn a living wage. On my knees, Mrs. Worthington, please, Mrs. Worthington, don't put your daughter on the stage. Don't put your daughter on the stage, Mrs. Worthington, don't put your daughter on the stage. Though they said at the School of Acting she was lovely as Peer Gynt, I'm afraid on the whole an ingenue role would emphasize her squint. She's a big girl, and though her teeth are fairly good, she's not the type I ever would be eager to engage. No more buts, Mrs. Worthington, nuts, Mrs. Worthington, don't put your daughter on the stage.
In the autumn of 1935, aided and encouraged by his new friend and manager, Jack Wilson, Coward started to work on one of the most complex and ambitious stage projects he had ever been involved with. Not one, but 10 new plays. These were all one-actors, designed to be part of a set and given the omnibus title, Tonight at 8:30. The idea was that a permanent company with himself and Gertrude Lawrence, under his own direction, would alternate the plays in a kind of repertoire, doing 3 different ones each night and 3 others on matinee days. The first performance was at the Opera House, Manchester, on October the 15th, 1935, when the sequence was opened by We Were Dancing, which Noel himself described as a light episode, little more than a curtain raiser. It was never intended to be anything more than that, and unlike its author, it has fulfilled its promise admirably. Noel and Gertie were now in their second and last London appearance as an adult couple, and their first success there was in We Were Dancing.
I only know that when we were dancing, an enchantment swept over me. An enchantment that I've never known before and shall never know again. Oh, it's obvious that our behavior must look cheap, childish, idiotic, anything you like. But it's true, this magic that's happened. It's so true that all ordinary ways of behavior look shabby and unreal beside it. My heart's thumping. I'm trembling like a fool. And even now when I'm trying so hard, so desperately hard to explain to you calmly and reasonably, I daren't look at her. If I did, my eyes would brim over with these foolish tears, and I should cry like a child. If you can imagine my embarrassment when you politely ask me to explain man to man, I cannot help but feel conventional apologies are all in vain. You must see, we've stepped into a dream that set us free. Don't think we planned it, please understand it. We were dancing, and the gods must have found it entrancing, for they smiled on a moment undefiled by the care and woe that mortals know. We were dancing, and the music and lights were enhancing our desire. When the world caught on fire, she and I were dancing.
The second play in this sequence was The Astonished Heart, an uncharacteristically portentous kind of drama about a psychiatrist who is undergoing his own kind of mental breakdown. Another play intonated at 8:30 is Red Peppers, which many consider by far the most successful. In it, Noel and Gertie played a song and dance couple down on their luck and filling in one of the lesser spots on the bill of a music hall in one of the smaller and seedier seaside towns.
Ladies and gentlemen, with your very kind indulgence, my wife and myself will present to you our famous nautical extravaganza. Thank you, Bert. That's right.
What's to be done with a drunken sailor, so the saying goes. We're not tight, but we're none too bright, great Scott, I don't suppose. We lost our way and we lost our pain to make the thing complete. We've been and gone and lost the blooming fleet. Has anybody seen our ship, the HMS Peculiar? We've been on shore for a month or more. When we see the captain we should get what for. Heave ho, my hearties, sing glory, hallelujah. A lady bold as she could be pinched our whistles at the Golden Key. Now we're in between the devil and the deep blue sea. Has anybody seen our ship? Oh, la, 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 la.
Shut up, shut up, shut up.
Here, Jack,
What?
who was that lady I saw you walking down the street with the other day?
That was no lady, that was my wife.
Wait for it,
wait
wait
for
for
it.
it.
Better to come, better to come. Yeah. Why did you leave school?
Why'd I leave school, Jack?
Yeah.
Appendicitis.
What do you mean, appendicitis?
Ha, couldn't spell it.
Oh dear, oh dear. Oh, isn't that pretty arc? It'll never get well if you pick it.
Oh.
That'll go better second house.
Here, Jack, where
What?
was you last night?
Where was I last night?
Where was you last night?
Cemetery.
Oh, I mean, anybody dead?
All of them.
That's a
Hey!
place for a minute, place for a minute.
I got a little riddle to ask you.
You got a little riddle to ask me, Jack?
Why is getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning like a pig's tail?
I don't know, Jack. Why is getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning like a pig's tail?
Twirly. Oh dear, oh dear. Now. What's two?
Yeah, Jack.
What?
I've been very worried about you lately.
Pourquoi, French?
I heard you had adenoids.
You heard I had
I
adenoids?
heard you had adenoids.
Don't speak of it. Don't speak of it.
Why not?
Adenoids me. Oh, what's to be done with the girls on shore who lead our tours astray? What's to be done with the drinks galore that make 'em pass away? We got wet ears from our first 5 beers. After that we lost control, and now we find we're up the blinking pole. Has anybody seen our ship, the HMS Disgusting? We've 3 guns aft and another one fore. They promise us a funnel for the next World War. Heave ho, my hearties, the quarter deck needs dusting. We had a binge last Christmas year, a nice plum pudding and a round of beer. But the captain pulled his cracker and we cried, oh dear, has anybody seen our ship? Has anybody seen our ship? The HMS Suggestive. She sailed away across the bay and we haven't had a smell of it since New Year's Day. Heave ho, my hearties, we're getting rather restive. We poured our money, spent the lot. The world forgetting by the world forgot. Now we haven't got a penny for the you-know-what. Does anybody see now? Anybody see now? Anybody see now? Now then.
Now then what?
Now then what?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, you don't you?
No, I don't, so shut up.
I suppose you don't know you mucked up the exit.
It wasn't my fault.
Whose fault was it then? Mussolini's?
Oh, funny, hey?
Well, I suppose you didn't drop your prop, did you? And having dropped it, you didn't have to go back for it, did you? Leaving me to prance off all by myself. Who do you think you are, Rebler?
Never mind about that. The exit was too quick.
Same as what it's always been.
Too quick, I tell you. It's been too quick the whole week. The whole number's too quick.
Bert Bentley takes that number at exactly the same tempo as he's always done.
Oh, you and your Bert Bentley. Just because he stands your Welsh rabbit at the Queen's, you think he's God Almighty.
Bert Bentley's one of the finest conductors in the north of England, and don't you make any mistake about it.
Finest conductor, my foot. I suppose he thinks it's funny to see us leaping up and down the stage like a couple of greyhounds.
If you're a greyhound, I'm Fred Astaire.
Oh, you're Fred Astaire, all right. With a bit of pavlova thrown in. You're wonderful, you are. There's anything you can't do except behave yourself like a gentleman.
Also, expect me to behave myself like a gentleman. That's a good one coming from you,
Oh,
I
shut
will
up.
say.
You make me tired.
I make you tired. I suppose it was me mucked up the exit. I suppose it was me dropped me blasted telescope.
Now, look here. Look here, George Pepper.
Will you stop George peppering me? Why can't you admit it when you're in the wrong? You mucked up the exit. Nobody else did. You did.
Well, what if I did? It was an accident. I didn't do it on purpose.
Lily, it doesn't matter how you did it or why you did it. You did it.
Oh, all right, I did it.
Well, don't do it again. Red peppers, 3 minutes. My God, we're off. Here, hurry.
Oh, come on,
Here,
come on. Don't
come
keep the customers waiting.
You got your cane?
Yes, I've got it.
Well, don't drop it.
Oh, all right.
But the most haunting and long-lasting of all the plays in Tonight at 8:30 was Still Life, the story of a married couple falling for other partners at a railway station. If this sounds familiar, well, it should, because 10 years later it was filmed as a brief encounter with Trevor Howard and Celia Johnson.
I remember Noel sending for me and reading me the play. And I was, as you can imagine, pretty delighted to be offered such a nice part. It's a wonderful part. And I really found the whole thing very different from any other film I'd done, because being in practically every shot, one got to know much more about filming than I'd ever done before. And one realized their difficulties as well as one's own. Whereas before, one had always been rather sort of kept apart by the technicians, who I think were always rather frightened of actors. Actors are frightened of technicians. So that became fascinating in a way. But I don't think it ever occurred to us that the film Brief Encounter was going to be, well, I suppose it's become in a way a sort of a classic. We just thought it was a nice, interesting little film. And we were very lucky in that it was, well, A, Noel's script, and B, having David Lean directing. And of course, Trevor Howard, who in those days was hardly known at all. I think he'd only made one picture before that. So that it was a amazingly sort of happy conglomeration of people and talents.
In the meantime, the grouping of so many plays into triple bills brought nothing but praise from the critics and the glittering first night audience, which included the Prince of Wales and Mrs. Simpson. Later in the run, one of the supporting cast, Alison Leggett, was taken quite ill and had to be replaced in all the plays by the actress who had now become Noel's greatest friend in the decades since her mother, Lillian Braithwaite, had co-starred in The Vortex. She was Joyce Carey.
I had probably the most enjoyable engagement I've ever had, because they were such a huge success, and it was such enormous fun having 3 different parts every night. And there was always one good one, you know, and 2 lesser ones. And one was always changing one's makeup or changing one's dress, and the whole thing was such a success, and they were such amusing plays to be in. You know, the laughter and the appreciation of the audience was simply wonderful. And then we went to America with it. And there it was a sensational success. And there were always queues around the theatre and everybody was asked out all the time. You know how New York is when there's a great success. And it was the most happy and wonderful time.
But on stage, what were Noel and Gertie like as a team?
Oh, they were wonderful together because they were both, you see, so quick. When you rehearsed a new play with them, they both knew it. Not absolutely perfectly, but pretty nearly. And they gave performance at the first rehearsal. I mean, it wasn't that plodding thing with books, you know. They really, really acted. They got on marvellously, except when Gertie did sometimes tend to overplay a bit. And Noel hated that more than anything. And there were a few little rows about it, and she never knew when she was doing it. Because she would give a marvellous performance, and he would say, that was really lovely tonight, you know. And then, perhaps very soon after, a rather slightly outrageous one. I don't think the audience ever knew, but from his point of view it was outrageous. And then she did that once, I remember, and I saw his enraged face while waiting in the wings. And when they went off, she said, "Was that better?" And, of course, if somebody really doesn't know, you know, you're up against a sort of quicksand, aren't you?
Early in the autumn of 1937, Noel was beginning to work on another operetta. Undaunted by the fact that Conversation Piece had never quite managed to live up to the international triumph he'd had in this romantic line with Bittersweet, Noel decided to try again. This time it was to be an operetta called quite simply operette. It ranged from romance to comedy, but it was in fact one of the least successful musicals that he was ever to write. It told the story of an imaginary Gaiety girl of the early 1900s who achieved stardom overnight, but then had to sacrifice her love life to her career. And within 2 acts and 17 scenes, Noel left no cliché of backstage life unturned. But then again, there were also some lovely and lilting songs, as his new secretary and companion Cole Leslie recalled.
And of course I was fascinated to hear the beginnings of a Noël Coward tune for the first time and to hear it develop. And at the end of the day, he wanted an audience, you know. Of course, I suppose a composer, like an actor, needs an audience. And he would say, well, let's sit down and have a drink, and he would play. And this became a ritual to which I looked forward enormously, as you can imagine. And then each evening he would recap, not only on the day's work, he'd play that several times, because there were no tape recorders, and he had to get that fixed in his head, you know. And he couldn't write music down, as you also know. But the show itself was not a great success. It didn't run very long, several months, I think.
But how worried was Noel now by the failure of operette?
I was terribly upset by it, and he would say to me, the fact is, it just isn't good enough. Let's face it. You know, as he always did, he always faced facts. And he said it just isn't good enough.
By now, Coward had also started to write short stories, but soon he found some crippling tax bills awaiting him, and therefore buckled down to the writing of not 1 but 2 new full-length comedies. One was Present Laughter, and the other This Happy Breed, and the plan was that both should open back-to-back in Manchester during the week of September the 11th, 1939. With the invasion of Poland, however, a few days earlier, it became more than somewhat impractical, because Noel had already promised that in the event of war he would go to Paris for the information service as a kind of propaganda supervisor. It was a job shrouded by secrecy.
I think the reason it was shrouded in absolute dead secrecy. The reason being, I think, that there was nothing of the least interest to be said about it. I think I ran a very efficient office, and I appeared at the office every morning at 9. We read through the monitors of the BBC. We discussed the war situation, had lunch, and that's how it went on for about 6 months. And then I got sick of doing absolutely nothing and said I must have some leave. I must go to America for 6 weeks to get my mind clear. And I went, and then, of course, bang, it went. So that was the end of that.
Coward, at the request of both Churchill and his friend Louis Mountbatten, now began the wartime troupe concerts, which were to occupy him all over the world, right through until the end of 1944. Noel's accompanist was a young pianist and writer who was to share not only these years with Coward, but also the post-war cabaret years. Norman Hackforth.
And I remember it was just after his studio had been bombed, and he was living in the Savoy in the River Suite, and he invited me to lunch, which was very sweet of him. And he'd just finished London Pride. I loved London Pride. I thought it was a great. It's really the finest patriotic song that was ever written, because it's so understated.
London Pride has been handed down to us. London Pride is a flower that's free. London Pride means our own dear town to us, and our pride it forever will be. Whoa, Liza, see the Costa barrows, the vegetable marrows, and the fruit piled high. Oh, Liza, little London sparrows, Covent Garden Market where the costas cry. Cockney feet mark the beat of history. Every street pins a memory down. Nothing ever can quite replace the grace of London town.
The next time we met was at the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo. And he said, I'm going to South Africa. Would you like to come with me? And that's when the whole wartime thing with him really started. We went to South Africa for, I think, was what was supposed to be about 3 months or something, 6 weeks, less. And while we were there, Mountbatten sent him a signal to say, would he go on to India and Burma and Ceylon? And that was the real tough part of the assignment. There's a kind of thing about troupe entertainment that it practically has to be who was that lady I saw you with last night, you know, and down at the Elbow and Brush. It isn't true. It wasn't true then, and I'm sure it's even less true today. They loved sophisticated songs, and every one of them really went, you know, and they never missed a point.
But one of these wartime songs got Coward into considerable trouble with the BBC. It was called Don't Let's Be Beastly to the Germans, and it was an acidly satirical comment on those who were already suggesting that when the war ended in Allied victory, the Nazis should be treated with some mercy.
Don't let's be beastly to the Germans when our victory is ultimately won. It was just those nasty Nazis who persuaded them to fight, and their Beethoven and Bach are really far worse than their bite. Let's be meek to them and turn the other cheek to them and try to bring out their latent sense of fun. Let's give them full air parity and treat the rats with charity, but don't let's be beastly to the Hun. We must be kind, and with an open mind, we must endeavor to find a way to let the Germans know that when the war is over, they are not the ones who have to pay. We must be sweet and tactful and discreet, and when they've suffered defeat, we mustn't let them feel upset or ever get the feeling that we're cross with them or hate them. Our future policy must be to reinstate them. Don't let's be beastly to the Germans when we've definitely got them on the run. Let us treat them very kindly, as we would a valued friend. We might send them out some bishops as a form of lease and lend. Let's be sweet to them and day by day repeat to them that sterilization simply isn't done.
Let's help the dirty swine again to occupy the Rhine again, but don't let's be beastly to the Hun.
Sadly, the satire of that was lost on Coward's listeners when he first broadcast it back in 1943, and the result was a sack full of abusive letters, and the decision by the BBC to ban the song for several years to come. Throughout the rest of the war, Noel continued to travel, singing to the troops all over Africa, India and Australia, and taking them a kind of message from their families back home. In London, at the end of one of these early wartime tours, the news reached Noel that his old friend and partner, Gertrude Lawrence, had married her new American theatre manager, Richard Aldrich. The cable he sent her read simply, "Dear Mrs. A, hooray, hooray, at last you are deflowered. On this and every other day, I love you, Noël Coward." Somewhat lost for somewhere to live between troop tours, he went for a short stay to the hotel at Portmeirion in North Wales. With him at the time was his old friend, the actress Joyce Carey, who recalled the writing of what was to become one of his greatest comic triumphs.
He started on Sunday morning at 8 and finished it the following Friday at about 6:30. He did read me scene by scene, Blithe Spirit.
And then, in 1941, Noel happened to meet again his old friend Louis Mountbatten, then deeply involved in the war at sea.
My own ship was the Kelly. Noel came on board on several occasions, particularly after we'd had various disasters, like having been hit by a mine, hit by a torpedo, etc. And then, after we were sunk in May 1941 in the Battle of Crete, I met him at lunch, and he asked me to tell him the story of how we were sunk. I did this, and he was obviously very moved. Later on, he came to me and said he now had an idea for the naval film, provided I would agree that it should be about my ship, the Kelly. I then agreed, provided it could not be traced back in any way to the Kelly, or above all to me. On that condition, I said I would help, and I did my best to help him, and in fact, he produced a film which, as far as I was concerned, was exactly like Life at Sea. All the survivors of the Kelly agreed that it was quite staggering to find how true to life the whole film had been.
The stars were to be Noel himself, Richard Attenborough, John Mills and Celia Johnson. The co-director, at Noel's request, was a young lighting cameraman called David Lean. The filming of In Which We Serve was complete by the middle of 1942, and then Noel decided he had to get back to troupe entertainment, this time not as a singer, but as an actor in 3 of his own plays, Blithe Spirit, Private Lives, and This Happy Breed. His new manager, the impresario Hugh Beaumont, recalled,
I used to go down to Denham where he had a house, and he started talking with great excitement about doing a 6-month tour of England. One tried to explain to him that the conditions were not going to be very easy. Nonsense, he said. It would be much more interesting. Because people who've gone into the provinces, they will be longing for entertainment. I would love to do 26 weeks. So we started off at the Grand Theatre, Blackpool. 3 first nights in a row, Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday. Because by this time he had revived Blithe Spirit for himself for this particular tour. And at the end of the tour, very exhausted, I'm sure, he got jaundice and had to leave the cast.
When he'd recovered, Noel did a London season of the 3 plays and then went back again to his troupe concerts. In Tripoli, in 1943, while talking to wounded British officers in an army hospital, he met a man who was later to present some of his work in the West End before becoming an associate director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, Sir Peter Daubeny.
It so happened that I was in a small ward with the adjutant of the Coldstream Guards. I was also we were in the same regiment. And a week after we'd been there, the matron came round and said that Noël Coward was going to entertain the troops. And I was absolutely determined to go to this concert. So as soon as she'd left, I started preparing myself. I went into Noel's room where he was washing, and he said, "What's the matter with you?" Because I was heavily swathed in bandages, and I said, "You know, I've lost my arm, and I shall never forget this because I felt that he was much more moved than I was, and I think through the sort of liquid heat and the strain and seeing all these wounded people and the fact that I knew him slightly, I got to know him very well later on, that I lost. He was so deeply moved, I can't tell you.
But these war years also brought Coward a few brickbats. In 1943, he was unwise enough to publish Middle East Diary, a somewhat smug and perhaps even patronising account of one of his troupe tours, which brought this review from Ivor Brown in The Observer.
Coward remains a puzzle. He sees so much and so little. He has travelled far more than most men of his age, and yet, when he writes, it always has to be of the same little world. Dump him anywhere, on any island of the 17 seas, and he would certainly at once run into somebody known as Tim or Tiny, Boodles or Bims, and be dining with an Excellency or an Admiral 20 minutes later. If there were natives on the island, he would hardly notice. God put them there, no doubt, to serve dinners to Excellencies.
Within a very few weeks of the end of World War II, it was clear that for Noel, as for countless thousands of others, the post-war years were going to require a considerable amount of readjustment. Noel had survived the war, but now he had to survive the peace, and he realised, sooner perhaps than any other actors or playwrights returning from that war, that the demands and conditions of his profession had altered drastically. Believing that returning servicemen wanted nothing more than glamorous escapist evenings, Noel first came up with Sigh No More, an only slightly modified version of those pre-war Charlot and Cochrane revues. Its stars were to be Cyril Ritchard and Joyce Grenfell.
A cable came from Noel saying that he was planning a revue to do in, I think, the midsummer of 1945, and would I be in it? So, of course, I cabled back and said, yes, I would, and I started to try and write things, and Richard Adamsel and I wrote some numbers for me to do, and in that show, I did a song of Noel's called This Is the End of the News, disguised as a schoolgirl with pigtails and all my makeup off and a shiny face and a terrible grin.
Of Miss Grenfell's co-stars, however, Cyril Ritchard was less than happy during the Sigh No More rehearsals.
They were torture, quite frankly, because Noel loved performing, as you know, and it was still in the war. And he had written 2 songs for himself, which he gave to me on a golden platter, that he had sung all over the Middle East and everything. They were brilliant songs, and I was very grateful for them. And but from the first day of rehearsal, because I put on a front, but I'm a very nervous person, and but the first day of rehearsal, he took the winter garden, which was empty, and the footlights were on, and when it ever came to the songs that I had to sing, Noel would sing them first, and then say, now you do it. And he also had visitors in, and this frightened the hell out of me, but Noel really wanted me to imitate his way of doing it, and I was determined I wouldn't. And that's where we clashed. For Nina, it was easier. I didn't imitate him, but I did actions that he wanted me to do, so I pass over that. And it was a great success, and it's a wonderful number. And his 70th birthday, when I was invited across for that midnight matinee, I did Nina at 3:30 in the morning, and it did stop the show.
Senorita Nina from Argentina knew all the answers, though all her relatives and friends were perfect dancers. She swore she'd never dance a step until she died. She said, I've seen too many movies, and all they prove is too idiotic. They all insist that South America's exotic, whereas it couldn't be more boring if it tried. She said quite frankly that she hated the sound of soft guitars beside a still lagoon. She also positively stated that she could not abide a southern moon. She said, I hate to be pedantic, but it drives me nearly frantic when I see that unromantic, sycophantic lot of sluts
forever wriggling their guts. It drives me absolutely nuts. She declined to begin the begin, though they requested it. And she made an embarrassing scene if anyone suggested it, for she detested it. Though no one ever could be keener than little Nina on quite a number of very eligible men who did the rumba. When they proposed to her, she simply left them flat. She said that love should be impulsive, but not convulsive, and syncopation had a discouraging effect on procreation, and that she'd rather read a book, and that was that. Begin the begin, though they besought her to, and in language profane and obscene she cursed the man who taught her to. She cursed Cole Porter too. From this it's fairly clear that Nina, in her demeanor, was so offensive that when the hatred of her friends grew too intensive, she thought she'd better beat it while she had the chance. After some trial and tribulation, she reached the station and met a sailor who had acquired a wooden leg in Venezuela, and so she married him because he couldn't dance. There surely never could have been a more irritating girl than Nina. They never speak in Argentina of that degenerate bambina who had the luck to find romance, but resolutely wouldn't dance. She wouldn't dance.
But for Graham Payn, Say No More was a rather more enjoyable experience.
As luck could have it, he'd pulled a muscle in his leg and didn't come to rehearsals for 2 days. And when he was at home, he wrote Matelot. And he called me up and said, I've got your song for you, come down and hear it. So I went over to the studio and heard the song, which was a beautiful song.
Jean-Louis Dominique Pierre Bouchon, true to the breed that bore him, answered the call that held in thrall his father's heart before him. Jean-Louis Dominique sailed away further than love could find him. Yet in the night he heard a light and a gentle voice behind him say, Matelot, Matelot, where you go, my thoughts go with you, Matelot, Matelot, when you go down to the sea. As you gaze from afar on the evening star, no matter where you roam, you will remember the light through the winter night that guides you safely home. Though you find women kind to be frail, one love cannot fail, my son. Till our days are done, Matelot, Matelot, where you go, my thoughts go with you. Matelot, Matelot, when you go down to the sea.
The critic in the Times next morning wrote,
"A light, easy, amusing entertainment, disconcertingly lacking any particular style. I say disconcertingly because it's been written, composed and directed by Mr. Noël Coward."
Other reviews were mildly favourable in the main, and by now Coward was already back at work on a new romantic operetta, his third since Bittersweet. This already had a title, Pacific 1860, and was taking rather hesitant shape as a love story about a world-renowned opera singer, Mary Martin, falling in love with a younger man, Graham Payn, on a mythical South Sea island. The impresario Prince Littler offered Coward the chance to reopen Drury Lane for the first time since its wartime occupation by Enser. The offer proved to be a mixed blessing, and the reason for that is explained by Cole Leslie, who after the war had rejoined Noel as his secretary.
He loved the musical itself. He was very proud of the score, and I think rightly. Particularly proud of his lyrics, which, if you reread them, I think are among the best he's ever done. And the book was weak. James Agate called it mindless bosh. And of course it was a failure. Let's face it, it ran for about 3 months. Drury Lane hadn't been used during the war except as Enser offices, and was bitterly cold. There was no heating, and it was a particularly cold winter. And as I say, it didn't run, but there was a great deal to recommend it. Mary Martin, of course, was enchanting. And it was a disappointment that I think the master never really got over. But it did not succeed because the story is not good enough, really and truly. And then I think Gladys's sets were a disappointment to him because after the austerity of the war years, if we could have had a tremendously lush, tropical atmosphere, that would have helped. I think the public by then were longing for colour and something exotic.
By the time Pacific 1860 had reached London, Rodgers and Hammerstein had revolutionised the musical theatre and made Coward's show, which it later followed into Drury Lane, look like something from another world, as Graham Payn recalls.
Oklahoma followed us in, and I went thinking, well, all right then, if you're so good, come on, let's just see. And of course they were. They were absolutely wonderful, and the whole new vitality had come in. We were doing gentle period pieces, and they came in with this punch that was absolutely marvellous.
Unlike those of Oklahoma, the songs of Pacific 1860 had an undeniable nostalgic charm, but reviews of the show were hallmarked by disappointment. Nevertheless, the advance booking had been good, and for the first weeks a respectable number of people turned up to shiver at Drury Lane every night. Soon, though, the notices and the fuel crisis of that post-war winter began to take their toll, and although Mary Martin and her cast played on doggedly for the next 4 months, the last 2 were, in Noel's own phrase, more of a convulsive stagger than a run. Coward himself, as usual, closed his mind to a resounding flop, a discipline which he had cultivated since his very earliest days in the business. And he decided to retrieve his reputation with a brisk revival of present laughter at the Haymarket. Then came a new play, Peace in Our Time. Set in an England supposedly invaded by the Germans in 1940, it was a strange and uncharacteristically bitter drama, notable for giving Kenneth More, Dora Bryan and Alan Bedell their first really good West End jobs. But as for the play itself, it was, wrote Alan Dent,
like watching 36 competent swimmers paddling in about 6 inches of water.
Noël Coward was simply not expected to turn up with this kind of problem play, and his style seemed somehow ill-suited to the content. As soon as Peace in Our Time had opened, Noel took himself back to Jamaica, which he had been meaning to visit properly ever since he'd landed there for a day or 2 while changing planes on one of those wartime tours. Later, he built his own house above the beach at Blue Harbour, and it was there, in the winter of 1949, that he celebrated his 50th birthday with Graham Payn, Cole Leslie and Joyce Carey. He spent that winter working on a new musical for Graham and Pat Kirkwood. It was to be called Ace of Clubs, and, as Cole Leslie remembers,
Ace of Clubs he wrote with great enthusiasm, and he had great fun doing it. It was a great departure for him, of course. Complete departure. A modern musical. And funnily enough, it was a sort of forerunner of Guys and Dolls.
Graham Payn also has clear memories of Ace of Clubs.
Well, it was a nightclub scene. I was a sailor on leave and fell in love with Pat Kirkwood, who was the cabaret star. But behind the scenes of the nightclub was gangsters. and they'd got confused. There was a present for one of the girls, and they were giving her a box of falsies. I think they came in a box. Anyway, they'd got muddled up with a box of jewels to make the plot right. And they got confused with the gangsters' jewels, and she got the real jewels and thinking they were paste, and the gangsters got the falsies. So it was a funny plot, really, and how to get them back again, and I got involved with the gangsters and knocked out and fights and so on.
And what kind of songs?
Oh, I thought really good ones. Sail Away originally came from that. That was a solo song that I had.
When the storm clouds are riding through a winter sky, sail away, sail away. When the love light is fading in your sweetheart's eyes, sail away, sail away. When you feel your song is orchestrated wrong, why should you prolong your stay? When the wind and the weather blow your dreams sky high, sail away, sail away, sail away.
And did that show do better, Ace of Clubs?
Yes, but it got hit by the press. They said he was playing down, because he was doing about delinquents and was modern. And the last time he was old-fashioned because he was writing about periods, so he couldn't win.
Well, there was a feeling at this time that whatever he did, as you say, somebody was going to complain about it. These were bad years for him as a composer.
It got knocked pretty hard. But we ran, I think, 7 months, 6, 7 months. But it was disappointing, because it was a good idea, and I still think it would work.
The other star of that show, Pat Kirkwood, recalled,
I first met Noel after I'd just finished playing in a show called Roundabout at the Naval Theatre. And I very nearly didn't meet him at all, because he rang home, my mother answered the telephone. Noel said, "This is Noël Coward speaking." My mother said, "Don't be ridiculous," and put the phone down. A few minutes later, Noel rang again. He said, "I've never had such an extraordinary reaction to my name before," and promptly offered me the lead in his new show that he'd written, Ace of Clubs, which he was to direct. I think the public reaction to Ace of Clubs was rather confused, because it was a different type of musical from anything Noel had written before. It was very much ahead of its time in that it was a realistic musical. It was basic, rather seamy in parts, and not beautifully dressed, as it was not supposed to be. And I think that a lot of people were very disappointed. They expected to see another Pacific 1860 or whatever, or Bittersweet. And this was not like that at all. And I also think the press were a little bit put out because they were caught unawares that it was something unexpected from Noel, you see. But there was some wonderful stuff in it. There was one song in particular, 3 Juvenile Delinquents, which was about the teddy boys of that period who used to knock old ladies on the head and various charming things. And Noel wrote some very, very funny lyrics. It used to bring the house down every show.
3 juvenile delinquents, happy as can be. We waste no time on the wherefores and whys of it. We like crime, and that's about the size of it. People say that films demoralise us, lead us to a life of shame. Mental doctors try to civilise us, psychoanalyse us, blimey what a game. They don't know how to treat us, for if they should beat us, that would never do. When they say go steady, we've the answer ready. And the same to you.
This was very typical of Noel, because if there was something that he disliked socially, and he was very socially aware, he used to poke fun at it. And in that way, it became less important. It was made to seem absolutely stupid and unimportant.
At the beginning of the 1950s, Noël Coward was in Jamaica at work on a new comedy. Only just over his own 50th birthday, he was now beginning to feel out of touch with his country and its theatre, and none of his recent shows had drawn the kind of audience that in pre-war years he'd almost always taken for granted. Still, there was that new comedy. Called Relative Values, it was about a dowager countess who discovers almost too late that her son and heir is about to marry a thoroughly unsuitable Hollywood film star. And it was written for an old friend of Coward's, my grandmother Gladys Cooper.
When we were touring with Relative Values, we had a very enterprising publicity lady who was always sending around the local newspaper photographers to photograph one. Well, I photographed very badly in stage makeup because I used to use rather a dark makeup and wasn't good for cameras. So always the most hideous photographs were appearing of me in the local papers the next day after we'd opened. And one particularly revolting photograph came out, and I got the sort of usual anonymous letter saying, "You old hag, why don't you go back to America?" So, come the dress rehearsal of the play in London, and Noel and Binky were in my dressing room, and our publicity lady came in and said, "Oh, the evening paper would like to photograph." I said, "Send them away, I wouldn't dream of it." And Noel and Binky looked very surprised. Said, "Well, why are you making a fuss, darling? What's it all about?" So then I told them the story. And of course they both fell on the ground. They roared with laughter. And the next night I had flowers from Noel saying, "You old hag, why don't you go to America and take my play with you?"
Relative Values opened at the Savoy in 1951 to ecstatic reviews both for Noel and for Gladys. The play ran there for nearly 500 performances, and its success re-established them both in popular approval. But that summer of 1951 was important for other reasons too, as Cole Leslie recalls.
He decided at one theatrical garden party, he was president of the Actors' Orphanage, that he would not do his usual thing of dressing up in a cutaway coat, or whatever you call a morning coat, and a silk hat, but he had a tent and gave half-hour concerts. I think he gave about 12 from 2 o'clock until the evening. And then, after all, he'd done many troupe concerts during the war, and they're very tough audiences. You have to learn to hold them. And from that, Norman Hackforth, who was accompanying master, then accompanied Beatrice Lilly at the Café de Paris, and somehow that idea sprang from that appearance at the theatrical garden party.
I was at the Café de Paris with B. Lilly, and Noel came to the first night, which was an absolute triumphant success. And we were having a drink afterwards, and he said, "Do you think I could do this?" And I said, "Of course you could do it." And he said, "Well, I'll think about it." And several weeks went by. And then finally I went round to have a drink or something at the studio at Gerald Road. And he said, "I've been thinking about that again. I think I might try." So I went to the Café de Paris management and said, "I've got a very interesting cabaret act for you here." And they said, "Oh, yes, who?" And I said, "Noël Coward." And they sort of looked at me blankly and said, "Oh, yes, what does he do?" And I said, "He just sings his own songs. I'll try and arrange for him to see you." I knew he was most anxious to see them. So we went round to the studio, and he played it so beautifully. He played the sort of shy, rather retiring boy, saying, "Oh, do you really think I could come and sing at the cafe? Oh, that would be lovely." And they offered him £750 a week, which really was a derisory salary, but he thought it was pretty good. And then, he sort of said, "Well, I do see. After all, you don't know what I can do. Yes, all right, I'll accept that." And he showed them out of the door, and he fell about when they'd gone and said, "It's a bit of all right, not so bad." And we went straight into rehearsal, and we opened about 5 or 6 weeks later to the most triumphant night I've ever known in my life.
Poor Uncle Harry wanted to be a missionary, so he took a ship and sailed away. This visionary, hotly pursued by dear Aunt Mary, found the South Sea Isle on which to stay. The natives greeted them kindly and invited them to dine on yams and clams and human hams and vintage coconut wine, the taste of which was filthy, but the after effects divine. Poor Uncle Harry got a bit gay and longed to tarry. This Aunt Mary couldn't quite allow. She lectured him severely on a number of church affairs, But when she'd gone to bed, he made a getaway down the stairs, for he longed to hear the answer to a few of the maiden's prayers. Uncle Harry's not a missionary now.
Coward's new triumph in cabaret, another example of the way he used to reinvent himself for every decade, guaranteed him financially for a while, which was just as well, considering that his plays were still very shaky at the box office. The triumph of relative values should by rights have been followed by an equal success with Quadrille, a period comedy he wrote for his old friends the Lunts. Somehow, however, that did not meet with much critical approval. But the following year Noel did have a success, not admittedly as a writer or director, but as the star of Bernard Shaw's The Apple Cart, which ran at the Theatre Royal Haymarket for several months during the coronation summer, one of the very few occasions in which Noel played somebody else's words. After it closed, Coward returned to Jamaica to start work on a new project, a musical adaptation of Oscar Wilde's Lady Windermere's Fan, to be called After the Ball. Among its stars were Peter Graves and Vanessa Lee.
When I read After the Ball, I couldn't quite define my feelings, although I instinctively felt that something was wrong, apart from the fact that I didn't feel that I personally was right to play Lady Windermere. And when we began to rehearse it and we began to play it, I suddenly realized that we were playing Oscar Wilde. And then the next scene would be Noel. Then there would be a trio, or perhaps a quintet, with Noel's wonderful lyrics, which were practically sending up the scene that we'd played before, which was for real.
The critical reaction was, shall I say, mixed. But I don't care what anybody says, the Coward lyrics were his very, very best. And if you listen to the long player, which I often do, with huge pleasure, it shows not only the charming music, but those wonderful lyrics of Noel's.
After much re-rehearsing, recasting and even rewriting, After the Ball opened to decidedly mixed reviews in June 1954. Coward followed this with more cabaret at the Café de Paris, and there, in his dressing room one night, as Cole Leslie recalls,
a complete stranger appeared, called Joe Glazer, who made the astonishing offer of Noel going to appear in Las Vegas, which seemed too remote. It was like appearing on another planet, and they obviously wouldn't understand his sophisticated English humour and English allusions. And so it was left indefinitely, but Mr. Glazer was a very determined gentleman, and the money which Noel needed badly at the time was very attractive. Finances were very low at this point. And in the end, he said, well, I don't mind if they throw beer bottles at me. For that money, I'll go. And to everyone's astonishment, especially Noel's, from the very first performance, which everyone said was death, the dinner performance at 8 o'clock, they adored him. And he had the most enormous success. And the second performance on his first night, Frank Sinatra flew a plane load of world-famous stars, all of whom happened to be friends, of Judy Garland, David Niven and his wife, Joseph Cotton and his wife, Zsa Zsa Gabor was there, everyone you can think of. And, of course, that was a riot. And so it got off to the most tremendous start.
Back in England, the press now viewed with some hostility Noel's decision to become a tax exile resident abroad, as Cole Leslie remembered.
It arose from his cabaret appearance in Las Vegas because there was big money, which, of course, the government would take the bulk of.
But to the press, it seemed to be a tremendous kind of breaking point, that there were articles, I remember, in a great many papers.
Oh, terrible articles.
Did he worry about that?
Of course he worried. He was essentially English, very proud of being English, and all to the end of his days. And now, famous people, skilled people, are leaving England in droves, and nobody says a word. But he suffered.
These mid-1950s were a mixed time for Coward. Professionally, he was finding new careers for himself as a cabaret star and film actor, and yet privately he was having to spend more and more of his time abroad, cut off from the country where he had spent so much of his life. Unperturbed, he wrote Nude with Violin for John Gielgud, but his next project was to be rather more serious, a play about the people he most cared about, actors and actresses. Entitled Waiting in the Wings, it was a play in Chekhovian style about a retirement home for theatrical folk, and its star was Dame Sybil Thorndike.
I'd just finished a play, and I was sitting there thinking, now I'm going to have a little bit of peace. And Peggy Webster and Noel came in with this play and said, we want you to do it. And of course, I was thrilled. I hadn't read it. I said, of course I'll do it. I hadn't read it even. Oh, I was thrilled with that play.
Waiting in the Wings was Noel's 50th produced play, and the stardom of Sybil Thorndike and Coward's own recovered strength at the box office kept it running well into 1960. But looking back over this period in Noel's life, I once asked his constant friend and companion, Cole Leslie, how badly the failures of the post-war years had really affected him.
His great strength, you see, was that if he had a failure and received very bad reviews, by that time he was already looking forward to the next thing. That, I think, was his eternal strength. The next thing was always going to be wonderful. So he was never dunched for long. And he had this very good plan, you know. After a show opened in London, he would stay for a day or a couple of days, and then off he would go.
I travel alone. Sometimes I'm east, sometimes I'm west. No chains can ever bind me. No remembered love can ever find me. I travel alone. Fair though the places and the faces I've known. When the dream is ended and passion has flown, I travel alone.
When he looked back on his career in the 1950s, there could have been no doubt in Noel's mind that for him they were the cabaret years. Of all the songs he sang in those British and American nightclubs, most came from shows which had first been staged 20 or 30 years earlier. By contrast, Sail Away, which opened at Bristol in June 1962, was really the last totally new Coward musical, in that its book, music and lyrics were all his own. Taking its title from a song that had first been an ace of clubs, this musical was built around a luxury cruise, and specifically around the character of the cruise hostess, immortally played by Elaine Stritch.
If you're mad to keep to be cultural, I'm the gal with whom you should roll. I can show you every ruin from Jerusalem to Greece, and also quite a few between Antibes and Nice. And if you can't live without antique pots, I'll find lots for you to take home. If you long to take bad photographs of classical debris, come to me, come to me. Or if you'd like to crouch in churches till you've water on the knee, come to me. Poor fools, come to me.
The reviews for Sail Away in London were rather less than ecstatic, perhaps because the book was not all that it might have been. But though Sail Away didn't set any English or American towns on fire, it did run comfortably through to the end of 1962. And while it was so doing, Noel returned to his new home on a mountainside above Montreux in Switzerland to start work on the words and music for yet another musical. This was to be based on a play called The Sleeping Prince by Sir Terence Rattigan.
Somebody in New York came to me with the idea of making The Sleeping Prince as a Broadway musical. Sleeping Prince was a play that I'd written for the Coronation, 1953, and that Larry Olivier and Vivian Leigh played. And then later it was done into a film under the title of Prince and the Showgirl, with Larry and Marilyn Monroe, which was a rather startling combination. And I wasn't too keen, really, on the idea, except that I said, if you can persuade Noël Coward to do the lyrics and the music, then I will agree, but under no other circumstances. And to my amazement and joy, he said yes, that, in fact, he would do it. And indeed, he did.
The star of The Girl Who Came to Supper was to be José Ferrer.
And it all went wrong, and I think the basic problem was the property, as they say in Hollywood itself. The Sleeping Prince by Terence Rattigan, as far as I know, never succeeded anywhere except in London. And here it had Larry and Vivian at their hottest, you see. And as a matter of fact, Larry wanted Rosemary Clooney, my then wife, and me to do it on Broadway, and I didn't feel that the play was strong enough. And later on, Michael Redgrave did do it with Barbara Bel Geddes, and it failed. And then Olivia himself did it with the great Marilyn Monroe in a film, and that failed. And then we did The Girl Who Came to Supper, and that failed. The play ran very, very, very long, and I knew it was too long, and Florence Henderson knew it was too long, and we offered, and we did make a list of our own songs and our own scenes that we were willing to cut, so that the curtain would come down not at 11:20 or 25, but around 11 o'clock for an 8:30 curtain. They wouldn't listen, and they said, "Do you quarrel with success?" and a few more tired old cliches like that, and anyway, it didn't work. I had known Noel for many years. I can't say that I'd known him intimately, but he was a warm, friendly, generous person, and whenever I met him, he had always long hours to spare for discussion and conversation about the theater, and he was... what is never said about Noël Coward is he always had time for people, and not just successful people, not the beautiful people or the jet set or cafe society. He had time for beginners, for youngsters. He would go to cellars in Greenwich Village and help kids who were trying out their wings rewrite plays, restage. He would direct them. He was limitlessly generous and self-effacing, never wanted any credit, and has not been given, I think, sufficient credit for his warm heart.
The Girl Who Came to Supper remains the only one of Coward's many musicals that has never been seen in England. But what Noel himself has called the Coward Renaissance had now begun. It started at first with Laurence Olivier, the actor who by his own admission owed one of his first real commercial successes to Noel and, of course, Private Lives. Olivier was by now the first director of the National Theatre at the Old Vic, and he decided that for his company's first play by a living author, the National should do Hay Fever, with a cast headed by Edith Evans, Maggie Smith and Lynn Redgrave, Noel himself directing. Its immediate success turned him literally overnight from an out-of-date tax exile into the grand old man of the English theatre, an imposing figure demanding new reverence for his longevity and admiration for the way that his reputation kept bouncing back. But Noel, as Cole Leslie recalls, still had one great ambition left.
For many years he had said to me, "I think I should like to write one more play, a really good vehicle for myself, and appear in it in London, and I hope have a great success." And it seemed rather unlikely that he would do such a thing. But there again, his determination got the upper hand, and he eventually wrote Suite in Three Keys. A Song at Twilight, the long one out of the three, is the important one. And that was what he had wanted to do, go back to the West End, where he had first started as an actor, and end in the West End with a big success. And that is what he did. It was rather a wonderful rounding off to his career, don't you think?
With Noel in Suite in Three Keys were to be two star ladies, Irene Worth and Lily Palmer, who, in Coward's own living room at Les Avants in Switzerland, once recalled that production.
When I look at this room, it reminds me of how we started rehearsing. In this very room we started rehearsing, because Noel wasn't well at the time. So Irene Worth and I, we came down here and started the play. After the first 2 weeks we went to London, another week. Irene and I felt we wanted to have another week at least, but Noel announced that as far as he was concerned, he was ready for the audience. And we were aghast because we said, we don't know our lines. Noel said, but I do. Well, it was easy for him, he'd written them, you know. However, we opened. I was trembling from head to foot and breaking out in sweat because for me it was double jeopardy. It's not English not being my first language, but and comedy being such a very national thing, you see. You can cry in any language, but play comedy. Well, I needn't have worried because Noel was supreme master at the art of comedy, of handing or withholding a comedy line. Handed the cues to me on a platter. Oh yeah, all I need to do is take it. You know? And I must say, all through the play, it was marvelous because to act with him, because he's such a wonderful professional. He gives you what is yours and he takes what is his, which is an actor's idea of heaven.
But now it looked as though Coward's career was practically over. He was living in a kind of semi-retirement with his two constant companions, Cole Leslie and Graham Payn. He was painting and writing short stories still, but there was a feeling that his working life, at any rate, was almost complete. He began to write another volume of autobiography, one sadly never to be completed. And then, towards the end of 1969, came the request that he would return to London, since one or two people in the theatre had made just a few plans for his 70th birthday. With him to London, Noel took his old friend Merle Oberon.
I remember the midnight matinee when we went into the box and everyone in the theatre, Princess Margaret started it, everyone stood up. And I tried to back away because it was so marvelous for him. That moment, I had tears in my eyes. I don't know how he was feeling. And then I thought the most thrilling thing was when after the interval and the curtain went up, and there was every actress and actor through the years who had been in every play, in every movie of his, all sitting grouped around the stage as though they were at a party. I said under my breath to him, "You must be dying." He said, "I'm a stretcher case."
Those few plans had by now turned into a massive media celebration on stage, radio, television and film, one which Noel himself was to christen Holy Week, and it led up to the announcement in the New Year Honours for 1970 that at last he was to be Sir Noël Coward.
Knighthood was most charmingly done. I was awaited in a pen with a lot of elderly gentlemen, and a very young man came in order to instruct us what to do. And he said, "Now look, you see this chair? You take a firm grip on the back of the chair. You then swing your left leg out, which brings your right knee into the right position for Her Majesty to give you the accolade." And I said, "If I grip the back of the chair and swing my leg right out, I shall fall flat on my face." And I think, having had all these years of making entrances and exits and things in the theatre, if you will just show me where the chair is, and I'll manage to work my way towards it and get there. Which indeed I did. It was quite simple. Then they said it was, remember about the backing away. So I said, well, I don't think that should, I haven't got a sword to fall over. I don't think that's going to be very difficult. So I backed away, but I'd spoken too soon and tripped. A slight trip, not a bad trip, but rather staggered. And the Queen remained absolutely still. And that finished me. Then I was carried out by the Grand Vizier.
By the end of these 1960s, Coward's songwriting, his playwriting and his screen appearances had all grown less frequent, though he was to be found with Michael Caine in The Italian Job. It's Cyril Ritchard who here recalls that by the time of his 70th birthday, Noel's health had begun quite suddenly and seriously to weaken.
Well, I saw him at that time on his 70th birthday, and then I saw him
when he, just about 3 weeks before he died, and he went to a big party at a restaurant, and he was sitting at a table, and I'd been talking to Graham about things past and having quite a laugh, and then I said, "Where is Noel?" So he took me around, and Noel had his back to me and was facing down a table, and I didn't realize he couldn't turn. And I said, "Noel." And he said, "I know that voice." And I said, "Well, why don't you turn around and look at me?" And he couldn't. And he didn't say he couldn't. And I realized that, and it was a terrible moment. And I said to him, "I'm going to leave you because there's so many people standing in line and want to talk to you, and I'm going to say hi to some of my friends." He said, promise me sincerely that you will never say hi ever again." Those were the last words he ever spoke to me.
So these last years were a time when Coward retreated more and more frequently into the company of those 3 or 4 people who had remained close to him for the best part of his life. One of them was, of course, Joyce Carey.
I just feel how immensely lucky I was to have such a wonderful friend, and for so long. And it always puzzled me. I used to think that divine creature is my dear friend, you know, with everybody after him, you know, all the invitations and everything, and he really and truly was awfully sweet and wonderful to one.
These 3 or 4 remaining years were marked by no more songs or plays, just a gentle retreat in the early 1970s, interrupted by occasional visits to London or New York, where in 1973 he made his last public appearance, side by side with his old friend Marlene Dietrich, at a performance of O Coward. The following morning, Noel flew to his winter home in Jamaica, and there, on March the 26th, 1973, he died. He was 73, and the Guardian obituary in London the next day noted, "Coward died as he had lived, with no self-pity and a ruthless instinct for the quick curtain." Noel was buried in his beloved Jamaica. His estate, valued only then in 6 figures, was left in the care of Cole Leslie and Graham Payn, who returned to London in June for a memorial service, at which the author of Private Lives, Hay Fever, Cavalcade, and countless other scripts was remembered above all for personifying another of his titles, Blithe Spirit. Tributes came in from all corners of the theatre world, which Noel had inhabited and dominated for so long. In a television interview not long before his death, Coward was asked for his own final comment on his life's work.
Now comes the terrible decision as to whether to be corny or not. The real answer is one word: love. Other answers will be jolly good company, filthy stories, anything you like, but the real answer is to know that you're among people whom you love and who love you. And that has made all the successes wonderful, much more wonderful than they'd have been anyway. And I don't think that there's anything more to be said on that. That's it.